Hello and welcome to another hot topic. This time round, I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Stewart Arnold, Deputy Leader of the Yorkshire Party. Stewart, welcome. Thank you very much for coming in.
Pleasure to be here, thank you.
Not everybody's familiar with the Yorkshire Party. You can just give us a little detail of its background and what it stands for.
Well, we set up about 3 years ago because we were keen to bring the argument about devolution to the north and in Yorkshire in particular. After all, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and even London had got devolution by that stage, and we felt that Yorkshire had the potential to miss out. And of course in that time since, devolution has come to certain other parts of England, not least to Manchester and Liverpool, one or two other places. So really that's our main angle, is to bring proper, accountable, democratic devolution to Yorkshire as a whole and set our own priorities here and spend the money accordingly.
So your party was founded before George Osborne spoke of regionalisation and the Northern Powerhouse and things like that?
Yes, we were formed in April 2014, so even before the Scottish referendum and before the Northern Powerhouse discussions.
That was in 2015. As you say, the other various parts of the country have got devolution. The events between the local government agencies and local governments in Yorkshire this summer have been chaotic, to say the least. The latest news is that a member of Parliament for Keighley, or Keighley I should pronounce it, shouldn't I? John Grogan, has asked the Archbishop of York to intervene and to mediate, like some sort of Terry Waite character. You must be exasperated.
Yes, because it looked at one stage as if we were going to get a one Yorkshire settlement, a one Yorkshire deal. But government, up until quite recently, been very keen on the idea of city regions in the same way as Manchester and Liverpool, based around Sheffield and Leeds. But the 17 of the 20 local council leaders in Yorkshire said we much prefer the idea of one Yorkshire as a devolution deal,
including the southern part of Yorkshire.
Well, two of the South Yorkshire authorities, in this case it was Doncaster and Barnsley, has split away from the Sheffield City region idea, leaving just Sheffield and Rotherham. And this looked like there was a real momentum, therefore, behind the one Yorkshire deal. And that was, obviously cross-party. There are Labour-run councils and Conservative-run councils getting together to say this is the best way forward. And John Grogan, as you rightly said, had a debate in Parliament where the Northern Powerhouse minister more or less said, no, we're not interested in that. We're going to press ahead with the Sheffield City region idea and tough on those two authorities that have decided to split away from the Sheffield City region. So yes, I am exasperated.
Well, that Northern Powerhouse minister, Jake Berry, he's happy, and his chief, Sajid Javid, the Secretary of State for Communities, they're happy for there to be a southern block, as it were, Rotherham, Barnsley, Sheffield, and Doncaster. They would have been happy to accept that. But why won't they have a whole Yorkshire with the southern part joined in as one county-wide authority?
Well, it's a very good question, and I don't really know the answer to it, because it seemed to me that you've got this body of opinion. It's almost like they didn't want to lose face. Because they talked about this city region for a couple of years, and it was on the stocks. And it's only relatively recently that, to be fair, that Doncaster and Barnsley have decided maybe there are other options to look at and split away. So I think it was sort of, in a way, the government was embarrassed by this. They have this real sort of fixation that cities are the way forward, and yet, as I say, it might work for Manchester, Liverpool, maybe even Birmingham, but there are other parts of the country where you're looking across, combining rural and urban areas together. So,
why did Doncaster and Barnsley say no? And the fact is that if they'd stayed in that little block of 4 in the south, then they would have been getting £900 million, or they'd have been getting their chunk of £900 million over 30 years. It's a very strange present to decline.
Well, yes, and I think that was obviously one of the attractions to sign up in the first place. I think really what happened was HS2 and the decision originally between the 4 authorities that the best place to serve the 4 was to have a station at Meadowhall as a sort of parkway station, and therefore everybody would kind of be covered. But Sheffield, the city, reneged on that somewhat down the track and said, excuse the pun, and said, actually, we want the stop to be in Sheffield, at Sheffield City, in the station, city centre, and forget Meadowhall. And I think the other authorities thought, yes, this is kind of like the writing on the wall here for what a city region might look like when it's dominated by Sheffield.
It seems a sensible decision, though, doesn't it? Nobody's going to get on a train in London to go shopping in Meadow Hall.
Oh, yes.
Even if it is only an hour or so away.
Well, you need to explain that to them. But there's obviously parking and issue and so on. And I think what's happening is the loop that comes into Sheffield is not really adequate, I think, to make a difference to the South Yorkshire economies. And that was really the whole point of the HS2 project.
The Yorkshire devolution, the plan has been presented. There are 5 different sorts of plans where the authority would cover slightly different territories, some people in it, some people out of it. Which is, or we might wish to add a 6th, feel free, but which is your preferred plan?
Well, our preferred plan is those areas of which are traditionally Yorkshire and basically covered by the 20 local authorities at the moment. And that seems to be, there's a kind of a synergy, there's a critical mass of 5 million people that has an economy over £100 billion per annum, and it's obviously has a sense of identity and a sense of history. So it sits, in my view anyway, it sits quite easily for Yorkshire as a whole.
Well, we'll come back to that sense of identity and sense of history. But you had a distinction between the city mayors, the metro mayors as they're known, as a level of local authority, and a regional authority which covers town and country. I can see how that might benefit the rural parts because value created in the towns can be taxed and then spent on the rural parts. I don't see what the towns get out of that.
Well, I think it's a bit of both, really. I think the rural area, some of the rural areas in Yorkshire are not that well off. In fact, some of the sheep farming areas.
And thus, I can see how they benefit from that.
But also, you could argue certain urban areas are the same. If you go to certain parts of Leeds and Sheffield, indeed any sort of parts of major conurbations, South Yorkshire, ex-mining towns, that sort of thing. So I think it's this sort of idea that yes, money would come into the economy as a whole. I'll give you an example. You talked about the 300 million. That's spread over a number of years in going to the city
30
region.
years, yeah.
So that's not a lot of money per annum. If you look at the Scottish Parliament, their budget is £35 billion a year. The sorts of figures that councils are having to cut from their budgets at the moment, Barnsley, for example, is £20 billion this year. That hardly is made up for in the terms of the money that's coming from the government as part of the city region. So I think a bigger authority in this terms, obviously Yorkshire, I think could qualify for a lot more cash. Plus the fact that you're unleashing the economy, hopefully overall, and building on it.
I don't want to dwell on the cities thing too much, but
Sure.
you've got 3 cities in Yorkshire that are more than 500,000 people. Leeds, Bradford and Sheffield. And that's about the size, if not rather bigger than Liverpool. And Liverpool is thriving not as the whole of Cheshire or the whole of Lancashire, it's just thriving as a city, not a city-state, but as a discrete unit. Would those advantages not apply? A disadvantage for the rest of Yorkshire, but advantages for Leeds, Sheffield and Bradford if they had their own government?
Well, it's possible, but I think what you're seeing is a kind of sucking in, even within Yorkshire, that places like Leeds and Sheffield are actually doing quite well in comparison to some of the cities and towns around them. And they haven't really quite recovered. And I think this is the whole point about the Yorkshire-wide settlement is just starting to spread the benefits a bit more. And of course, with the city region model, then what do you do with somewhere like Hull? And the East Riding, and they've missed out. The government has already said they're not big enough to be a city region in their own right. So they're left, basically out on a limb.
Well, I was going to ask about the Humber. Nobody wants Humberside back, but Yorkshire and the Humber, there are claims for Lincolnshire and the Humber as well, but Yorkshire and the Humber, would you regard that as a viable option? Because the border can't just go down the river. It's the whole Humber, both banks working together, that is one economic region.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to the idea. I'm not sure that I'd want to reinstate the Humber in that form. It would be the Yorkshire Assembly or Parliament. So if Grimsby and Scunthorpe wanted to come in, of course, that's entirely up to them. But whether they would or not, I'm not sure. But I don't think it gets, we don't miss the synergies of the economic cooperation across the Humber, just because we have, say, a Yorkshire Assembly and a Lincolnshire model. That will still go on, obviously, and maybe with the instigation of a super port which would actually bring the two sides of the Humber together. I know this is something that's being kicked around at the moment.
I think you're that goes back to the history and heritage, doesn't it, of the two counties' relationship together.
Yeah.
We might move on to that in the second half. Thank you, Stewart. Come and join us again a couple of minutes' time in the second half. Welcome back. I'm still with Stewart Arnold, Deputy Leader of the Yorkshire Party. Stewart, we've talked about the economics and the failure of devolution to be achieved so far, because nobody seems to be able to agree on it. Let's just talk about the politics of this in terms of Yorkshire's relationship with the rest of the country. We talked about history and culture. There is a degree of chauvinism in Yorkshire, isn't there? God's own county.
Yeah, there's a sense of pride. I would accept that for sure, and it's sort of laced with the idea that things could actually be a bit better, because Yorkshire's taken a hit over the last generation or so in terms of especially in terms of its economy and the sort of staples that were here, the textiles, the steel, the coal, and the fishing, and I think there's a view that. We haven't quite recovered from that yet, and there's certainly two things which need to be improved, and one is educational attainment. There needs to be much more investment in education and to prepare people with the skills and qualifications and so on. And the other thing is infrastructure investment, which we're severely lacking.
But how's that different from the rest of the country?
Well, I think possibly not in some ways. Certainly London has benefited from a big investment in education and this idea of something called the London Challenge, which was the instigation of the mayor, bringing people together right across from the assembly, from parents, teachers, the local boroughs and that sort of thing, to push them up from the bottom of the attainment league to the top. So it's not just about money. I think it's also a sense of direction and a sense of cohesion and all sorts of different things other than just resources.
Well, resources important though, money important. That £900 million over 30 years would have been nice and might still be, but it is still money from central government, largely raised by taxing the south and the southeast, and that London, as you mentioned, and then spent in the north. There is, to some extent, you're going flat cap in hand as Yorkshire people to the southerners and saying, give us money.
Yeah, and it's not great because obviously ultimately the government can turn around and say, well, you're not worthy, and for any particular project
It's not that you're not worthy, it's just that the people in the south have stopped wanting to give the people in the north money that they've earned and that they've had taxed from.
They're little devils. No, they should be giving us money. It's really, no, I think, look, you've got to start somewhere, and as I said, I think the economy actually is lagging behind. It's somewhere about 15 to 20% below the national average, and it shouldn't be there. You know, even if you bring it up to the national average, that means that we generate a lot more money ourselves within the region. And longer term, actually, I think if you want to be honest as a politician, you have to say to people, yes, I'm spending your money, but that's also I'm going to be raising the money and from you, and this is, you know, in terms of taxation. And I think that's, you know, eventually this is how we'll go. It won't be all taxes, but I think there has to be some tax that says, you know, we're trying to be honest with you.
Well, I raised the matter partly because of what's the nature of regionalism at the moment, which is clearly a very hot topic in Europe as a whole. Britain wanting to separate itself from the greater whole of Europe, but Catalonia especially. Now, I can't help thinking that Londoners must occasionally look at the regions and feel as Catalonians do as they look at the provinces of Spain. Catalonia is taxed heavily, it's the richest part of the country, and that money subsidises the rest of the country. Catalonians, some proportion of them, are clearly sick of paying for the rest of Spain. Are you not worried, as a regional politician, somebody supporting regionalism, that there's going to come a point where the southeast is going to get sick of carrying the rest of us, and that they're going to behave as people are behaving now in Barcelona?
Well, it could happen. I don't sense that's at the moment, but I think there's even more incentive, therefore, to have to improve the regional economies and to push the powers down so that they can.
But
do
that's what they
things for
say in
themselves.
Andalusia when they're spending money made in Barcelona.
Yeah, but as I said, I don't think it needs to be like this in Yorkshire. I don't think that there is nothing instinctive or intrinsic that says we have to have our economy at 15% less than the national average. Why can't it be as good as the South East? I know London is possibly an exception, but there's nothing in Yorkshire. I mean, everybody works as hard, and the facilities are here. The potential is here for sure to improve our economy. And once you do that, then I think that improves obviously the economy of the UK as a whole, because then we don't have to go cap in hand to London and the South East for that cash.
Well, one day Yorkshire may be self-sufficient.
Yeah, why not? Yeah.
I just want to say with that idea of the regionalism, and not, I know it's not nationalism, although there are some in Yorkshire who would say that it is a nation, and it is about the same population as Scotland. But it's that idea of regional separatism, and I know that's not what you're advocating, but that there is a degree of balkanisation as populations reduce, as rather than coming together, as has been the story for most of the years since the Second World War, and the European Union, I suppose, being the biggest example of that. But even, 1603, 1707, the United Kingdom is itself a confederation of people coming together. Is this the trend now for people to be wishing to be governed more closely to themselves? And is that a kind of a parochialism which suggests a feeling that I am entitled to something that somebody living in another part of the world is not entitled to?
Well, it could be, but I think it's an interesting point. There are many reasons why this is happening, and it may be that the nation state is perhaps redundant to the extent it might have been 100 years ago. This is something I read. The nation states came together in the sort of 17th century because military power was important. That's what you did. That's how you beat up your enemies around you, and you acquired lands and territory and all the rest of it. So sort of military power, the importance of economic solidarity within that has created the nation state. So we're not sort of in that business anymore of going around beating up our neighbouring countries. So maybe the rationale for a nation state is much less. And I think the other point is the world is a complex one at the moment, and people kind of sort of hanging on to things like community, like family, like friends, which kind of is important to them. And I think possibly I don't know, it may feed into that, but I may have said it to you before. But after the Brexit referendum, I heard people saying, well, that's Brussels sorted, now we have to sort out London. And is this sort of sense, that's the third thing perhaps, this sort of sense of disengagement.
So how far do we withdraw sovereignty? May I be, in my little house, may I be the sovereign ruler and sole citizen? And I will require you to have a passport before I make you a cup of tea.
Oh, it's very possible. If that's the way you want to go, yeah, why not? But no, I think that then again, we come back to the idea of what is a community, what is a sense of identity, and what works at what kind of level. And I think, these are the sorts of discussions, obviously, they're having in places like Spain at the moment, and there's all sorts of tensions on the back of that. And to a certain extent, France and Italy are the same. And we have had that too, with Scotland, obviously. Discussions in Ireland at the moment. Where do we go with Northern Ireland, for example?
I'm fascinated by what you say about the nation state. Firstly, because without the nation state, London would be under no obligation to subsidise Yorkshire. But secondly, the alternative to nation states is the sort of the city-state, as it were, like ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy, where the city is sovereign and independent. Now, again, I know you're not advocating that, but that does, as an alternative model, that does reflect back to the idea of metro mayors rather than regional mayors.
Yes, it does. I think, though, as I said, I think the sense of Yorkshire as an identity across large cities, towns, market towns, villages, countryside, seaside, and that sort of thing is very strong. And I think it's really, if you go anywhere really in Yorkshire, people will have their own rivalries within their cities. Places like Hull and Leeds have a sporting rivalry. But if you get down beneath the surface, they still do identify themselves as Yorkshire. And you're right, we're not advocating independence at all. We're just advocating greater devolution within the UK.
It's fun to think about, though, isn't it?
Possibly.
We can't go too far without mentioning Brexit. I think that every time a journalist mentions the word Brexit, he should give €1 to charity. But what will be the consequence of Brexit for Yorkshire?
Well, we still don't know, and I think this is part of the problem we face without this devolution and anybody kind of to speak on our behalf as a whole, because you've got Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and even London. Even the London mayor has a seat at the table from time to time when Brexit negotiations or discussions are taking place, putting the case for their particular communities. Obviously, with London, it's sticking up for the City of London and the financial sector, but we don't have that, and I think this is a big problem at the moment, with nobody speaking on behalf of Yorkshire in terms of its industries, and we still have a strong manufacturing industry.
Nobody's speaking on behalf of Yorkshire per se, but various parts of Yorkshire, there are people who are advocates for their cities, for the Humber seaborne economy, and for instance, agriculture. Nobody's unrepresented. It's just that nobody's representing Yorkshire as a unit.
Well, there is that, but I don't think they're even representing Yorkshire, the individual parts, because at the moment, for example, David Davis had his powwow recently in York, of all places, and yet nobody from Yorkshire was represented there, because the only people he spoke to were the 3 northern metro mayors. That's Manchester, Liverpool, and the Tees Valley. So this is a big loss for us. I wouldn't mind even if some of the local authority leaders were taken in, especially of the bigger cities, but they're not involved in the Brexit negotiations. It's much easier if you have a single voice for Yorkshire at these things.
Stewart, thank you very much. We're going to have to stop there. All I can say is by gum. And you must look forward to a phone call from the Archbishop of York. Thank you, Stuart. Join me again next week for another Hot Topic.